Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Season 1, Episode 8, The Beginning of the End. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary of exactly what happens within this episode. Sheridan brings Mordred into Camelot in order to stock up on herbs when he is betrayed by the shopkeeper and is executed while allowing Mordred to escape. Mordred then gets Merlin's help in fleeing the guards and is harbored by Morgana in her room, who feels an incredibly strong connection to Mordred. Later in the episode, Kilgara reveals that Mordred is destined to kill Arthur, urging Merlin not to help him, which then leads to a rather conflicted Merlin almost not helping to save Mordred, but in the end he does, and Arthur helps to rescue him and returns Mordred to Isildur and the other druids. So now that I've rewatched the episode, it's the part of the video where we rank the episode on our two ranking lists. The first is mostly objective, which means that it is absent emotion. And then the second is the personal ranking list, which is fully my opinion and how I felt about the episode. So I've highlighted the mostly objective rank values that apply to this episode. And we will start with the multi-season supporting character introduction, which this is the first episode that we meet Mordred, who, of course, as was noted in the summary, is destined to kill Arthur and is being raised by the druids. And he is worth 3 points. We then have our multi-season main character growth, and I felt that this applied to Arthur. We've seen in the past of, well, actually many episodes, we've seen that Arthur is incredibly reluctant to not do exactly as his daddy says. Like, even when it goes against his own morals, his own ethics, his own thoughts, he will carry out his father's orders. However, in this episode, almost from the start, he pushes back against the orders, though he does follow them at first, and he follows them right up until he basically has to arrest Morgana and the child as they are trying to escape the lower town. We then, of course, after that, Morgana comes to him for help, and he does decide to go against his father's wishes and comes up with a plan that will allow Morgana to not get in as much trouble or to have an alibi who is Uther himself, while Arthur and Merlin rescue Mordred, who even Arthur thinks his father's going too far in trying to execute a child out of fear of what they potentially could grow into, just because he happens to be being raised by druids. So it is that character growth in that we see him going against his father's orders, doing what he feels is morally right, but then also when he does meet with Isildur and the other druids, he is very respectful, even asking for Mordred's name, which I feel like the Arthur we met in episode 1 would not have done. And so I do feel that he grows a bit in this episode, and that is worth 4 points. We also have a little bit of world building taking place where we're learning that those with magic can communicate telepathically, which Mordred does frequently, but we do see that Merlin is also able to respond to Mordred's voice in his head and speak to Mordred as well when he is hiding behind a cart from the guards. So we get to see that a bit. We learn that Merlin has other names, and his name among the druids is Emrys, which of course implies that his destiny is far greater than even he knew, as he was only aware of his one name of Merlin, but Kilgara tells him that he has many names, and there is much written about him, most of which he has not read yet. We then, of course, learn about we've learned about the prophecy with regards to Merlin and Arthur, two sides of the same coin. Merlin's destiny is to protect Arthur, and Kilgara tells him he will not be able to succeed at that if Mordred lives, thereby implying, of course, that Mordred is the one who is destined to kill Arthur, and therefore his destiny is in direct opposition to Merlin's. Which brings us now to our really only negative of this episode, which was I felt like Merlin's character kind of regressed a bit. We've seen Merlin throughout the series so far being very set on his path. He is very do the things that he thinks is right, even in spite of potential consequences. You know, with the disease in the Mark of Nimue, we saw him curing Gwen's father, even though that eventually led to Gwen being arrested. We've seen him do a lot of things. He usually will follow his own idea of what is right. And yet, in this episode, even before Kilgara directly tells him that Mordred is going to kill Arthur, Kilgara earlier in the episode, when he meets him for the first time in this episode, says that, you know, he shouldn't be helping Mordred, and he immediately becomes conflicted. He immediately starts acting coldly towards Mordred. And then here at the end, once he finds out that he's going to kill Arthur, despite it going against his moral and ethical, like his morals and ethics, he literally just lays in bed. He's going to like sacrifice not only Mordred, but Arthur, who's helping him, in order to kill Mordred, or rather let him die. And it's not until Mordred like literally starts like panicking about having like he's going to die, he doesn't want to die. Emrys, I know you're there, I know you're listening, I know you're ignoring me, and all of this in his head that he finally gets up and then he comes to the to save them, which of course relieves Arthur. But like even Mordred could tell that he was delayed for a reason, and even as he's leaving, Mordred turns back saying that they are going to meet again. And I'm just there thinking like if you had just followed your morals and ethics that you had at the start from the start, you wouldn't have left such a bad impression on a young impressionable child, and maybe things wouldn't end up the way that they do. We of course explore this more in season 5. We'll talk about it more there, but I felt like his willingness to compromise his moral and ethics when in the past he's shown that he's not the type of person to do that is a regression of his character overall. But even with that -1, it still brings us to a 10 out of 10 episode for this on the mostly objective ranking. So as a reminder of our rankings so far in season 1, we have in first place The Dragon's Call. This episode is now second place, the beginning of the end. Then we have Lancelot, Valiant, The Poison Chalice, The Gates of Avalon, The Mark of Nimue, and in last place, A Remedy to Cure All Ills. And this is where we come to the personal ranking, which is where my own opinion fits. Now, before rewatching this, I thought I really liked this episode. I have fond memories of certain moments in the episode, and I thought I really liked it. And then I was watching it and I was like, you know what? Actually, I'm kind of bored. There were some call out moments, and I will call those out. But overall, I was kind of very disappointed. It could just be a matter of like my expectations were higher because I had misremembered really liking the episode. And then when I actually was rewatching it, it just hit harder that it wasn't what I had thought it was. But yeah, I thought I liked this episode more. Obviously, like at this point, Mordred is a little child, and I have to give the actor kudos because he does a very good job at being ominous as a child. Like, basically, he's got like this completely blank look on his face almost the entire episode. Even like when he's suffering from the fever, he's like blank. And then he's speaking into people's heads. And it's just like there's certain times where like he's just staring with a blank face and it just comes off as so ominous. When Saradin is executed, he inside of their heads yells no and then shatters a mirror, showing that he does in fact have magic, not just like active magic, not just like the telepathy, but is able to shatter a mirror, which also indicates that similar to Merlin, he has a certain level of wild magic that he's not necessarily in full control of, that is more based on his emotions or instinct, which brings a little bit of a parallel between them, I feel. We then have, of course, the fact that as soon as Morgana sees him, she is like instantly all in on they have a bond, they have a connection, they are tight, they are besties, they are together forever. She goes really hard on this bond. She's willing to even sacrifice her own self and her position as the king's ward, etc., etc., all for this kid that she has just met, doesn't even know the name of, which we can, of course, read in knowing Kilgara's prophecy that that is destiny. They are the villains, or destined to become the villains of the story, even though they are not at this point the villains. But it is really in that ominous thing because it's like, why is there such a connection? It's not fully explained in this episode why him and Morgana have such a connection. Like, obviously, it's revealed that he is the one who's going to kill Arthur, that, you know, he's the adversary of Arthur and Merlin and such. But, like, for Morgana's part, it doesn't really, unless you know the future being a rewatcher, that part isn't really explained. It's just like, wow, that's a connection. Is it magically induced? What's going on here? But I have to say, most of it was basically them running around trying to save this Mordred, and then Mordred lying with a fever because he was wounded um, when Ceradan was captured. One of the guards got a cut in, so he was injured on his side and wounded, which is why he has to stay in Camelot so long for him to be healed. But like that base storyline, it was a little bit boring. I mean, it was meaningful to the story's plot. Like, I don't think it was a weak plot concept by any means. It just, from a viewer perspective, it just wasn't very interesting. I didn't have the best time. I was kind of there, and I'm like, oh, I thought this episode was ending. I thought we were at the end. Weren't we at the end yet? And I thought that at least like 2 or 3 times throughout the episode, like, we're still going? Like, we haven't resolved this? Shouldn't that not have resolved there? But that's just like, again, a personal opinion. It just was not the most fun. However, there were some standout moments in this episode. So there is a point when Arthur comes in to search Morgana's rooms for Mordred, who is hiding behind a curtain, and Merlin, who's peeking through the curtain, notices that Mordred's boots are at the end of Morgana's bed, and so he uses a spell to make them tiptoe over to be hidden. And then, of course, Arthur starts to come into view, so then he sends them backwards and they tiptoe behind a column. And I think that was just, it made me laugh out loud a bit. There's also when, because Mordred has a fever, and at first Merlin doesn't want to involve Gaius in their, what's the word I'm looking for? I was going to say subterfuge, but I don't think that's the right word. Anyways, in their harboring of the criminal child that is Mordred, they don't want to involve Gaius, or at least Merlin doesn't want to involve Gaius, so he decides to go and try to figure out how to treat the fever on his own by looking through Gaius's books and collecting some herbs that the book points to. But before he can return to Morgana and Guinevere, who are taking care of him, Gaius comes in, notices the book is there, and wonders why it's there. Merlin, then quickly trying to cover for himself, said that he was just reading and that, Gaius's work is fascinating when Gaius points out he's never been interested before. And this, of course, completely backfires because then Gaius decides that they have to start his education now that he's finally showing an interest in his work. And so he basically like waylays him, has him read this big, thick book about anatomy for several hours. And by the time he gets back to Morgana and Guinevere, it is nighttime because he has had to study all day because of his own bad lying skills, which it is still shocking to me. Even 8 episodes in, I am shocked that nobody has figured out Merlin's gift because, hello, he is such a bad liar. And the fact that they go like 5 seasons without him getting caught, I'm like, how? Even at episode 8, I am shocked. And by the time we get to the end of the series, we'll all be shocked. But eventually they do have to bring in Gaius because what Merlin does not work because he is not skilled as a physician. And Gaius reluctantly helps, offers to treat the boy, basically says, if you get caught, you're on your own. He's not, covering for them. Which, fair play, fair enough. And then the next funny part, and this part was incredibly funny. I laughed out loud. I had tears in my eyes. Even remembering it, I chuckle because it is that funny. There's a point when Merlin and Morgana's initial plan was to sneak into the lower town through a secret door in the armory that's hidden behind a shield that only Arthur has the key for. And so they have to get Arthur's keys. This plan, of course, backfires, which is why eventually Arthur is the one who ends up taking Mordred through the tunnels out of the walls with Merlin's reluctant and late help. But at this point, anyways, Merlin goes, he has to get the key from Arthur. So he uses magic to float the keys up. Of course, they jangle. Which, that's what keys do. And of course, he has them hiding behind Arthur's head. So every time Arthur, hears the sound of the jangle and turns his head, the keys move with him and jangle. And there's this whole scene where he's, getting up, looking around, thinking he's going crazy, wondering, what the noise is. And Merlin's pretending he can't hear it. He has no idea what he's talking about. It's all in his head. And then, of course, eventually he does hide the keys in the soup. And Arthur, of course, hears the splash, and Merlin once again is like, I don't know what you're talking about. And eventually then, Arthur kind of storms from the room in frustration, which allows Merlin to then go and retrieve the keys from the soup. It's a soup or a stew. It's very thick, which is why I think stew. But there are also very thick soups. And it is orange in color, which would lead more toward a soup. Not that that's important to anybody, but I'm not sure if it's a stew or a stew. But it's a bowl of liquid food. Like I said, even retelling it, it makes me laugh. It was one of the highlights of this episode and my favorite part, and literally the only reason that it scored as high as it did on the personal ranking was because of this scene, because I could not mark it lower with how funny the scene was. Having said that, I will now reveal that the personal score for this episode is a 6 out of 10. And that brings us then to our season 1 rankings so far in the personal ranking. In first place, as my favorite episode so far, we have The Poison Chalice, then The Dragon's Call, The Gates of Avalon, Lancelot. This one went into 5th place, The Beginning of the End, and then Valiant, The Mark of Nimue, and my least favorite so far is A Remedy to Cure All Ills. And so at last we come to our final segment, which is the series ranking so far, which is where we're ranking each of the seasons against each other, and we discover the score for the season based on the scores we give each episode. And so on the mostly objective ranking, we've added 10. That brings us up to 52 out of 130. And then on the personal side, we're adding 6, which has brought us also to 52 out of 130. And with that, we've now watched and ranked Merlin, Season 1, Episode 8, The Beginning of the End. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.